The dawn of February 17th, 1600, seeps slowly and reluctantly through the thick Roman fog, a mist mixed with hearth smoke and the damp smell of the eternal city. On the Campo dei Fiori, the field of flowers, no one is selling flowers or vegetables yet. Instead, carpenters are finishing the morning's main attraction, a tall post surrounded by neatly stacked bundles of firewood. The air is dense, cold, and it vibrates with the unspoken anticipation of the crowd flowing in from every alleyway. Artisans, merchants, nobles in closed palanquins, and cardinals whose scarlet robes seem like clots of blood in the gray haze. In the center of this theater of cruelty and piety, they lead a man. His name is Giordano Bruno. He is 52 years old, and he has spent the last 8 of them in the dungeons of the Inquisition. His face is like parchment on which suffering has written its chronicle, but his eyes, deep-set and dark, burn with an unquenchable, almost manic energy. In his mouth is the gag of silence, a cruel device piercing his tongue and cheeks so that he cannot shout his final heretical curses and confuse the faithful. He is being led to his death for believing in other worlds, for asserting that the stars are distant suns, orbited by their own planets, possibly inhabited. So the legend goes, a legend as convenient and simple as the blade of a guillotine. But looking at this emaciated face, at these unbending eyes, it is impossible not to ask the question that echoes across the square, drowning out the prayers and gossip. Was it really just for this? Did the most powerful organization in the world, the Holy Office of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, spend 8 years on interrogations, trials, and torture just to burn a man for his cosmological fantasies? Or is this popular version merely the tip of the iceberg, a convenient screen hiding Bruno's true crime? A crime so deep and fundamental that his judges feared to even speak its name aloud, preferring to burn his body so his poisonous ideas could not spread. The smoke from the future pyre already tickles the nostrils, and in this smoke, the central question of our story is born. Why did the Inquisition really burn Giordano Bruno? To understand the scale of the tragedy on the field of flowers, one must first feel the pulse of the era in which it occurred. The end of the 16th century was a time of immense tension, when Europe, like a taut bowstring, was ready to snap. The Great Schism, begun by Martin Luther nearly 80 years earlier, was no longer a mere theological dispute. It had become a bloody geopolitical reality that had redrawn the map of the continent. The Catholic world, having survived the shock of the Reformation, responded with fierce and organized force. The Council of Trent, which lasted intermittently for nearly 2 decades, concluded in 1563, and its decisions became an unbreakable wall, cementing Catholic dogma for centuries. This was the age of the Counter-Reformation, a great restoration, a great purge. Its main instrument was the Holy Inquisition, reorganized and strengthened into a total organ of ideological control, its tentacles reaching into universities, printing houses, royal courts, and even confessionals. The pyres burned not only with witches and random heretics, but with thought itself, if it dared to step beyond the boundaries drawn by Aristotle and approved by the Church. This was a world where the scientific revolution was only just taking its first, timid steps. Nicholas Copernicus's work, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, was published in the year of his death, 1543, and was not yet officially banned. But it was seen by most scholars and theologians as a strange mathematical hypothesis, unrelated to reality. Galileo Galilei, a future prisoner of this same Inquisition, was still a young professor, decades away from his famous clash with the Church. In this intellectual landscape, where any deviation from the Aristotelian Ptolemaic model was considered a challenge to divine order, Giordano Bruno was not just an innovative scholar, he was an explosion. He was an intellectual comet, whose fiery tail carried not only new ideas about the stars, but a flame that threatened to burn the very foundations of European civilization to the ground. He appeared in a world desperately searching for stability and unity after decades of chaos, and in response, he offered it infinity and chaos. The origins of this fiery nature are found where the earth itself breathes fire, at the foot of Vesuvius. Filippo Bruno was born in 1548 in the town of Nola, near Naples. This landscape, where fertile vineyards grow alongside cooled lava under the constant threat of eruption, seemed to imprint itself on his soul, creating a strange mix of creative force and destructive fury. His father was a soldier, a man of simple rank, and from him, young Filippo inherited a warrior's spirit, an intolerance for authority, and a readiness to fight for his beliefs to the very end. At 17, driven less by piety than by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, he joined one of the most prestigious and intellectually powerful orders of the time, the Dominicans. Taking his vows at the monastery of San Domenico Maggiore in Naples, he received a new name, Giordano. This monastery was not just a house of prayer. It was the largest scientific and philosophical center in southern Italy, possessing a magnificent library. Thomas Aquinas himself, the greatest synthesizer of Catholic theology, had once studied here. For Bruno, it was paradise. He dove headfirst into the works of Aristotle, Plato, the Church Fathers, and of course Aquinas. His memory, as he would later claim, was phenomenal, capable of holding thousands of books. His dialectical mind, honed by strict scholastic discipline, astounded his mentors. But the Dominican order, created to fight heresy, had unknowingly forged its most perfect and most dangerous weapon. By giving Bruno access to limitless knowledge and teaching him the art of debate, the order gave him the tools he would soon turn against his own creators. The monastery walls, which were meant to protect him from worldly temptations and heretical thoughts, became his first prison, an intellectual crucible in which his genius was reforged into heresy. He did not yet know that in joining the order, he had chosen not the path to salvation, but the long road to the stake. But the Renaissance, which had intoxicated Italy, was not just a rebirth of classical art and humanist philosophy. From the depths of history, from dusty Byzantine and Arab manuscripts, other texts were unearthed, texts far more ancient and, as it seemed then, far more powerful. This was the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical and magical treatises attributed to a legendary Egyptian sage, Hermes Trismegistus, who was believed to be a contemporary of Moses and the source of all wisdom, from which Plato and Pythagoras had supposedly drawn. In the 15th century, these texts were translated into Latin and had the effect of an exploding bomb on the minds of European intellectuals. For them, this was not just curious reading, it was a revelation, an alternative gospel, a pre-Christian primal theology that promised man something unthinkable, the chance to know God directly, without the mediation of the church, and even more, the chance to become God-like himself by mastering the secrets of nature and magic. Hermeticism taught that the universe is a living, divine being, permeated by sympathies and antipathies, and that man is a microcosm, reflecting the entire macrocosm within himself. By learning the laws of these connections, a magician could control reality, heal diseases, predict the future, and even command spirits. It was this intoxicating cocktail of Neoplatonism, Egyptian magic, astrology, and alchemy that became Giordano Bruno's key to understanding the world. He saw in Hermeticism not just a set of occult practices, but a universal religion capable of reconciling all existing beliefs and sciences. He came to believe that Christianity was merely a distorted and degenerated version of this ancient Egyptian wisdom. This conviction became the prophecy he declared for himself and the curse that defined his entire destiny. He decided his mission was not just to study this wisdom, but to become its new prophet, to purify it of later corruptions and return it to mankind. This was not a scientific insight. It was a religious conversion, one that set him on a direct collision course with Rome. The monastery cell at San Domenico Maggiore was a place of humility and prayer for most of the brothers. But for Giordano, it became a swirling cauldron where incompatible ingredients were mixed. By day, he diligently studied the works of Thomas Aquinas, sharpening his ability to build flawless logical arguments and conduct theological debates. But by night, by candlelight, he secretly devoured what was strictly forbidden: the books of northern humanists, especially Erasmus of Rotterdam. The satirical and critical spirit of Erasmus, his mockery of monastic ignorance and church superstitions, fell on fertile ground. Bruno began to ask questions that, within the walls of a Dominican monastery, were equivalent to treason. He removed images of the saints from his cell, leaving only a crucifix. He entered into disputes with his teachers, questioning one of the most fundamental and incomprehensible dogmas of Christianity, the Holy Trinity, hinting that it was an absurd philosophical construct that distorted the idea of a single, indivisible God. He also challenged other pillars of the faith: the divinity of Christ, whom he considered merely an exceptional magician, and the virgin birth of Mary. His mind, forged and tempered by church scholasticism itself, now turned against its creators like a rebellious golem. He used their own weapons, logic and dialectic, to expose contradictions and inconsistencies in the sacred texts and dogmas. This was no longer innocent curiosity or scientific skepticism. It was a direct, conscious, and defiant attack on the very foundations of the Catholic faith. He didn't just doubt certain aspects of the doctrine, he rejected it entirely, seeing it as a superstition for the masses, hiding the true esoteric truth accessible only to elite minds like his own. The monks, at first amazed by his erudition, soon began to fear him and then to hate him. He became a stranger in his own home, an intellectual outcast whose very presence poisoned the atmosphere of piety and order. And it was only a matter of time before his subversive thoughts spilled out and attracted the attention of those whose profession it was to hunt men just like him. The point of no return was crossed in 1576. By this time, rumors of the young, brilliant brother Giordano's heretical statements had already escaped the monastery walls. An official investigation was launched against him on charges of heresy. He was accused not only of reading the forbidden books of Erasmus, but of far more serious crimes against the faith, doubting the dogma of the Trinity. Bruno understood perfectly what this meant. He had seen how the Inquisition's machine worked: denunciations, interrogations, torture, and ultimately the stake for the unrepentant. Possessing many things, but not humility, he did not wait for the trial. One night, he cast off his black and white Dominican robe, the symbol of his belonging to the hounds of the Lord, and fled Naples. This escape was not just an act of self-preservation, it was the final, definitive break with his past and the beginning of a new, wandering destiny. From this moment on, he was an eternal exile, an intellectual pirate without a flag or a harbor, hunted by the Catholic Inquisition, and met with suspicion by every other confession. Thus began his 17 years of wandering across Europe, an odyssey where his Ithaca was not a home, but the unattainable ideal of absolute intellectual freedom. He would travel to Geneva, Toulouse, Paris, London, Oxford, Wittenberg, Prague, Frankfurt, and Zurich. The geography of his movements is astonishing. In every city, he would seek patrons, students, and a platform for his ideas. And in every city, he would inevitably make powerful enemies. His personality, an explosive mixture of genius, incredible erudition, monstrous pride, and absolute refusal to compromise, prevented him from settling anywhere for long. He was the living embodiment of intellectual rebellion, storming any bastion of orthodoxy, whether it was Catholic, Calvinist, or Lutheran. The escape from Naples was his first battle, and he lost it, losing his home and his status. But it was this defeat that transformed him from a dissident monk into the Giordano Bruno that history would remember, a restless wanderer of the spirit, whose only homeland was his own mind, as boundless as the universe. What truly drove this man, forcing him time and again to challenge the most powerful institutions of his age, knowing the price was eternal exile and mortal danger? Was it simply an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, a quest for truth, as his later admirers liked to portray it? He was, without question, a genius with an insatiable intellect. But to reduce his motivation to this is a gross oversimplification. Deep inside, in the most secret corners of his soul, a conviction of his own exceptionalism, his own messianic role, was growing. He saw himself not as a mere philosopher or scientist, but as a prophet, the harbinger of a new era, destined to bring salvation to mankind. But this was not salvation through Christ and the Church. It was salvation through a return to the true religion, the ancient Egyptian wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus. In his worldview, Christianity, like Judaism, was merely a temporary and grotesque distortion of this primal truth, a religion for the rabble built on false miracles and superstition. He, Giordano Bruno, was the messenger sent to restore this ancient magical cult, to purify it and make it the new universal religion for the intellectual elite. This religion did not demand blind faith. It demanded knowledge. Its temples were not churches, but observatories and laboratories. Its saints were not martyrs, but magicians and philosophers. Its chief prayer was the contemplation of the infinite universe, which itself was the true and only manifestation of God. For Bruno, God was not a person sitting on a heavenly throne, but the impersonal soul of the world, infused in all things, in every star, every stone, every person. And man, by knowing the laws of nature through magic and science, could unite with this divine force and become a creator himself. This was not just a challenge to Christianity. It was a declaration of its total and final replacement. It was this inner demon, this secret messianic motivation, that was the fuel powering his untamable energy, compelling him to charge forward, oblivious to the dangers. He believed he was bringing light to mankind, never understanding that in the eyes of his contemporaries, this light was merely the glint of hellfire. His first stop in exile was Geneva, the Protestant Rome, the citadel of Calvinism. Perhaps Bruno hoped to find more tolerance here, among the enemies of his chief enemy. It was a naive hope. He quickly discovered that John Calvin's rigid and ascetic theocracy was no less dogmatic and intolerant of dissent than the Catholic Church. He enrolled in the university, but his explosive temperament and his habit of challenging all authority immediately led to conflict. He published a pamphlet fiercely attacking one of the most respected philosophy professors, accusing him of ignorance and listing 20 of his errors in a single lecture. The reaction was immediate. Bruno was arrested, excommunicated, and exiled from the city. This episode was a cold shower and an important lesson. Freedom of thought had no permanent home in any of the warring religious camps. His weapons in this fight were not just ideas, but himself, his personality, and his incredible abilities. His greatest trump card was the art of memory, a complex mnemonic system dating back to antiquity, which Bruno had perfected and filled with occult and magical content. For him, this was not just a technique for memorization. He believed that by creating complex memory palaces in his imagination, filled with symbolic images, he was not just organizing knowledge, but grasping the divine structure of the cosmos and gaining magical power over reality. To the uninitiated, his demonstrations looked like true miracles. He could listen to hundreds of words in any order and repeat them flawlessly, forwards and backwards. He could hold debates for hours, quoting entire volumes from memory. This ability opened the doors to the palaces of nobles and kings, creating an aura of a magician and wonder-worker. His true strength, and simultaneously his curse, was that he did not separate science, philosophy, religion, and magic. For him, it was a single, indivisible whole. And it was this unity, which he considered his greatest discovery, that in the eyes of his contemporaries made him the most dangerous of heretics. Exiled from Geneva, Bruno traveled to France, arriving in Paris in 1581. This would be one of the most successful periods of his life. At the time, France was being torn apart by brutal religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots. The monarchy, under King Henri III, was desperately searching for a third way, an ideology that could reconcile the warring factions and strengthen the throne. The king himself was a complex, mystically inclined man, fascinated by Neoplatonism and esoterica. Bruno's ideas about a new, universal religion that stood above denominational squabbles arrived at the perfect moment. Rumors of the Italian's phenomenal memory reached the king, and Bruno was summoned to court. He made an indelible impression on Henri, who became convinced that Bruno's memory was the result not of natural skill, but of powerful magic. Bruno, a good psychologist, did not rush to dissuade him. He received a generous royal salary and, most importantly, patronage, which protected him from attacks by the Sorbonne, Paris's conservative university. Under the king's protection, Bruno published his first important works on the art of memory, such as On the Shadows of Ideas. In these texts, he laid out his magico-philosophical system, where Copernican cosmology was bizarrely intertwined with Hermetic magic and Neoplatonism. He became a fashionable figure in the intellectual salons of Paris, his lectures drawing crowds of students. For the first time in his life, he tasted fame and influence. The geopolitical landscape of France, wounded by religious fanaticism, became the perfect stage for his sermons on tolerance and a new post-national religion. But this tolerance was merely a tactic. In his heart, he despised both warring faiths, considering them equally false. His goal was not reconciliation, but replacement. And while he enjoyed his triumph in Paris, his enemies in Rome and in France itself watched him closely, adding his name to their blacklists. In 1583, with letters of recommendation from the King of France himself, Bruno traveled to England. This visit would become one of the most dramatic and pivotal moments in his wanderings, demonstrating his greatest strategic blunder. He arrived in London with high hopes. Elizabethan England was a country of relative tolerance, a center of humanist culture and scientific inquiry. Bruno quickly fell in with a circle of leading intellectuals, befriending the poet Sir Philip Sidney and the enigmatic scholar and magus John Dee. It seemed he had found the perfect audience for his ideas. The culmination was to be his visit to Oxford, England's oldest and most prestigious university. He expected to stage a triumphant debate in which he, defending Copernicus's heliocentric system, would shame the backward Aristotelian professors. Everything went wrong. The debate was a catastrophe. Bruno, true to form, was defiant, arrogant, and aggressive. He didn't so much prove his point as shower his opponents with insults, calling them a constellation of pedants and ignoramuses clinging to dead dogmas. But most importantly, his argumentation shocked the rigorous English scholars. He defended Copernicus not with mathematical calculations or astronomical observations, but with quotes from Hermes Trismegistus, mystical insights, and magical philosophy. To the Oxford dons, who were beginning to lay the foundations of future scientific methodology, this was pure charlatanism. They saw in him not an innovative scientist, but an arrogant Italian magician who was covering his intellectual failings with a flood of esoteric nonsense. He was expelled from Oxford in disgrace. This failure was fatal for Bruno. He failed to understand that the world was changing, that his syncretic, magical science was being replaced by a new one, based on experiment and strict logic. Instead of finding powerful allies in England's emerging scientific community, he burned every bridge, turning the very people who might have appreciated his cosmological guesses against him. The Oxford debacle tragically demonstrated Bruno's paradox. He would enter history as a martyr for science, yet in his own life, he was rejected by scientists themselves. Bruno's life was woven from paradoxes, and his relationships with people were no exception. He possessed an incredible charisma, capable of charming kings and intellectuals, but his same monstrous pride and intolerance pushed people away, turning potential friends into enemies. His circle in England was telling. His main patron was the French ambassador, Michel de Castelnau, in whose house he lived and wrote his most important works. His intellectual companions were, to some extent, people who themselves straddled the line between science and the occult. Philip Sidney, one of the greatest poets of the Elizabethan age, was charmed by Bruno's Neoplatonic philosophy. John Dee, the famed mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and, as it was whispered, royal spy and necromancer, was perhaps the only man in England who could speak Bruno's language, the language of hermetic magic and angelic hierarchies. They were united by an interest in the universe's secrets, though Dee tried to grasp them through complex mathematics, while Bruno relied on philosophical insight. But these alliances were fragile. Bruno had no true disciples willing to follow him to the end. He made enemies, however, with frightening ease. The entire academic elite of Oxford saw him as an enemy of reason. The Puritan clergy, gathering strength in England, considered him an atheist and an agent of the devil. And of course, spies from Catholic powers, especially Spain, watched him sleeplessly, seeing him not just as a heretic, but as a dangerous ideological operative. Bruno existed in a web of complex political intrigues, but blinded by his mission, he failed to see the danger. He was certain of his genius and invincibility, viewing his opponents as pathetic pygmies. This intellectual snobbery, this contempt for the crowd, would ultimately leave him completely alone before his greatest and most merciless enemy. It was in London, in an atmosphere of relative freedom, that Giordano Bruno wrote his most radical and explosive works. Among them was the dialogue The Ash Wednesday Supper, published in 1584. This work became his philosophical Rubicon, the point of no return. On the surface, The Ash Wednesday Supper is a passionate defense of Copernicus's heliocentric system. But Bruno goes much, much further. For him, the Copernican system was not just a better mathematical model. It was the key to a new, grandiose worldview that would completely destroy the old one. He didn't just place the sun at the center of our solar system. He declared that the universe is infinite, with no center and no edge, that the stars we see are suns, just like ours, and each of them has its own planets orbiting it. And most terrifyingly for his contemporaries, he asserted that these countless worlds are not lifeless deserts, but are inhabited by their own intelligent beings. This idea, which seems almost banal to us today, was pure dynamite for 16th century theology. If countless inhabited worlds exist, then the entire drama of human salvation, described in the Bible, shrinks from a cosmic event into a minor provincial episode. Did Christ visit other planets too? Did his sacrifice redeem the sins of beings in the Orion Nebula? If not, then God is unjust. If yes, then the act of redemption becomes an endless series, devaluing the unique and sacred sacrifice of Christ. Furthermore, an infinite universe demolished the very idea of heaven and hell as specific geographical locations. The entire tidy, hierarchical structure of the Christian cosmos, with earth at the bottom, hell below it, and the heavenly spheres with God at the top, collapsed, dissolving into a uniform, infinite space. Bruno knew exactly what his cosmology implied. He wasn't just correcting an astronomical error. He was deliberately knocking the keystone out of the foundation of the entire Christian worldview. The Ash Wednesday Supper was not a scientific treatise. It was a theological bomb, and its clock was already ticking. After leaving England, Bruno continued his wanderings in Germany. This period of his life was marked by incredible intellectual productivity and a growing sense of his own rightness, which gradually swelled into a true mania, into what the ancient Greeks called hubris, pride that challenges the gods. He arrived in Wittenberg, the symbolic heart of the Reformation, the city where Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. Paradoxically, the Lutheran University welcomed him with open arms. For 2 years, he lectured on Aristotle and seemed to find a temporary refuge. In his farewell speech, he even praised Luther as a great reformer. But this was merely a tactic. For Bruno, Luther, Calvin, and the Pope were all just leaders of warring sects who failed to understand the true universal religion of which he was the prophet. Soon, his radicalism and intolerance led to conflict with the Lutherans, and he was exiled once again. He moved on to Prague, to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolf II. Rudolf's court was the largest center in Europe for alchemy, astrology, and all manner of occult sciences. The emperor, a melancholic and eccentric monarch, spent fortunes supporting alchemists and magi. Here, Bruno was in his element. He dedicated several of his magic-filled works to the emperor and received payment in return. At this moment, he likely reached the peak of his intellectual power and his pride. He was no longer just a philosopher. He was the Nolan, the herald of a new dawn, the man to whom the secrets of the gods and the universe had been revealed. He sincerely believed his mission was to unite a fractured Europe under the banner of his new Hermetic religion, which would absorb the best of philosophy, science, and ancient magic, while casting aside the superstitions of Christianity. This blinding self-confidence, this sense of being chosen, made him deaf to the voice of reason and the instinct for self-preservation. He considered himself invincible, protected by the force of his genius. It was in this state of hubris that he would make his final and most fatal mistake. While Bruno was preaching his new faith in Prague and German cities, the clouds above his head were gathering. His books and ideas spread across Europe, alarming not only the Catholic Inquisition, but also Protestant orthodoxies. His name became synonymous with godlessness and intellectual anarchy. And then, in 1591, while he was in Frankfurt overseeing the printing of his latest works, he received a letter. It was from Venice, from a young, wealthy aristocrat named Giovanni Mocenigo. Mocenigo, having read Bruno's books, was enthralled by his wisdom and invited the philosopher to Venice to be his personal teacher. He promised a generous salary and safe lodging. What did he want from Bruno? Mocenigo was obsessed with acquiring secret knowledge. He believed the art of memory was not just a mnemonic technique, but the key to powerful magic that could grant power, wealth, and the love of women. He wanted Bruno to teach him these secrets. For any other man wanted by the Inquisition, an invitation to return to Italy, directly into the lion's mouth, would have sounded like a death sentence. Friends warned Bruno, sensing disaster. But he, blinded by his hubris and his belief in his mission, saw the invitation as the hand of fate. Venice was an independent and proud republic, traditionally at odds with the papal throne. He believed he could find protection there. But most importantly, he saw a chance. A chance to return to his homeland not as an exile, but as a victor, to bring the light of his truth to the very heart of Italy, and perhaps even begin the reform of the Catholic Church from within. He was certain his eloquence and the power of his ideas could persuade anyone. It was a fatal error, a fateful act, the turning point that set in motion the relentless chain of events leading directly to the pyre on the field of flowers. He was walking into a trap, set less by Mocenigo than by his own monstrous pride. The inner world of Giovanni Mocenigo, the man whose name is forever linked with Giordano Bruno's betrayal, was a complex cauldron of ambition, fear, and disappointment. He was not an operatic villain. He was a typical man of his class, rich, educated, yet superstitious and vain. He sincerely believed Bruno was a great magician, privy to the highest secrets. He expected from his teacher not complex philosophical lectures about the soul of the world or infinite universes, but concrete practical results. How to charm a woman, how to find hidden treasure, how to become invisible. He wanted magic. He got metaphysics. For several months, Bruno lived in Mocenigo's Venetian palace, teaching him his art. But time passed, and no miracles occurred. Mocenigo's disappointment grew by the day. He began to suspect that Bruno was either deceiving him or simply withholding the most important secrets. And to this disappointment, fear was added. Mocenigo began to realize just how dangerous and heretical his guest's ideas were. In their private conversations, Bruno was frank. He mocked the Church's sacraments, called monks donkeys, denied the divinity of Christ, and claimed to believe in reincarnation. Mocenigo realized he was harboring not just a freethinker, but an arch-heretic, and that merely sheltering him could land Mocenigo himself in an Inquisition prison. Fear for his own skin and wounded vanity, these were the two components of the betrayal. When Bruno, sensing trouble, announced he planned to leave for Frankfurt, Mocenigo knew he had to act. He could not allow the carrier of such dangerous secrets and a witness to his own interest in magic, to walk away. And so he decided on the simplest and most cowardly step. The endgame began on May 22nd, 1592. On that day, Giovanni Mocenigo, having locked Bruno in a room of his palace, sat down and wrote his first denunciation to the Venetian inquisitor. The next day, he supplemented it with another, more detailed one. These documents are a chilling mixture of truth, half-truth, and outright fiction, dictated by fear and the desire to paint himself as a pious Catholic who had exposed a dangerous heretic. Mocenigo meticulously listed all the blasphemies he had heard from Bruno. He reported that the Nolan considered Christ a trickster and a wretched fellow, whose miracles were phony, while he, Bruno, could perform far greater ones. That he denied transubstantiation, the changing of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. That he claimed worlds were innumerable and eternal, and that human souls reincarnate. That he condemned the Catholic Church, calling its dogmas asinine foolishness. That the Virgin Mary could not have given birth while remaining a virgin. It was an exhaustive list of the most terrible heresies imaginable. Each accusation alone carried a death sentence. Mocenigo did not forget to mention Bruno's involvement in magic and divination. Based on this denunciation, the Inquisition immediately ordered his arrest. That same night, guards burst into Mocenigo's palace and arrested Giordano Bruno. His 17 years of wandering across Europe were over. He was on Italian soil again, no longer as a free philosopher, but as a prisoner whose fate was sealed. The arrest and the beginning of the trial in Venice, paradoxically, gave Bruno some hope. The Venetian Republic, La Serenissima, had always zealously guarded its independence from the papal throne and conducted its own, often pragmatic, policies. The Venetian Inquisition was considered one of the softest in Italy. Its tribunal included not only clergy, but also secular representatives, appointed by the government to protect the Republic's interests. Bruno, a brilliant debater, decided he could defend himself. During the interrogations, he was cunning. He did not renounce his ideas, but tried to present them in the most harmless light. He used a tactic that Galileo would later attempt, splitting truth into two levels. He argued that his teachings on the infinity of the universe and the multiplicity of worlds should be considered according to philosophy and natural light, not according to holy faith. He claimed that as a Christian, he accepted all church dogmas, but as a philosopher, he was free to hypothesize. For a time, this strategy seemed to work. The Venetian judges were perplexed. They saw before them not a mad fanatic, but a brilliant intellectual who skillfully defended himself. It is quite possible that if his case had been decided in Venice alone, he might have escaped with a relatively light punishment, public penance, and a few years in prison. But Bruno's figure was too large and too infamous across Europe for his case to remain a local Venetian incident. In Rome, they had been watching him for a long time. As soon as news of Giordano Bruno's arrest reached Rome, the Holy Office knew that a truly big fish had fallen into its net. For the Roman Curia, Bruno was not just another heretic. He was the symbol of everything the Counter-Reformation was fighting. Intellectual pride that undermined church authority, the mixing of Christianity with paganism and magic, and the dangerous virus of free thinking that had been infecting minds across Europe for 17 years. He was a walking encyclopedia of all possible heresies. To leave him to the judgment of the Venetians meant, for Rome, showing weakness and allowing such a dangerous criminal to possibly escape his deserved punishment. A fierce diplomatic battle began. The Roman Inquisition, led by the powerful and unbending Cardinal Giulio Antonio Santori, demanded that Venice immediately extradite the heretic. Letters flew to Venice, arguing that Bruno was a Neapolitan by birth and should be tried where he was first accused of heresy. Furthermore, Rome argued, the gravity of his crimes was of a universal, not local, nature. Venice resisted at first, citing its own laws and sovereignty. It was a matter of principle. But the pressure from Rome was colossal. Pope Clement VIII personally intervened. Every lever was pulled, from threats of excommunication to political blackmail. In the end, the Venetian Republic, unwilling to start a full-scale conflict with Rome over one inconvenient philosopher, buckled. They understood that further resistance would cause more problems than it was worth. Bruno's fate was decided not in a courtroom, but in the back rooms of high politics. The man who saw himself as a citizen of the universe had become a pawn in a game between two Italian states. On February 27, 1593, Giordano Bruno, bound in chains, was handed over to representatives of the Papal States. This day marked the beginning of his final and most terrible journey, a journey into the abyss of the Roman Inquisition. As the gates of the Venetian prison closed behind him and he was taken to Rome, all hope of rescue vanished. He was entering the eternal city, which he had once dreamed of conquering with the force of his intellect, not as a prophet of a new faith, but as a captive whose fate was sealed. He was placed in the prison of the Holy Office, located in the Vatican. Thus began 7 long, agonizing years of confinement, designed to break his body and spirit. These were years of endless interrogations, led by the most skilled theologians and lawyers of the time. They were years of solitude in a damp, dark cell. We know from the records that he was subjected to torture, although the specific details remain a matter of historical debate. The Inquisition's goal was twofold. First, they wanted to extract from him a full and unconditional recantation of all his errors. The public repentance of such a famous heretic would be a tremendous victory for the Church. Second, they sought the names of his accomplices and followers across Europe in order to root out the heresy completely. But Bruno held on with astonishing persistence. He continued his Venetian tactic. He argued, he defended, he tried to interpret his writings in a more acceptable light, but he refused to renounce the core of his philosophy. He was willing to admit to mistakes, but he was not willing to admit his entire life had been a mistake. For 7 years, Rome tried to break his will, and for 7 years, he continued his final battle, the battle for his right to think. The central figure in Bruno's Roman trial, his chief opponent, and, in a sense, his dark twin, was Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. This was no ignorant fanatic or sadist. Bellarmine was one of the most brilliant intellectuals of his age, a preeminent theologian, a Jesuit scholar, and a man the Catholic Church would later declare a saint and a doctor of the Church. He was as intelligent and educated as Bruno, and he possessed the same unbending will. Their confrontation was not a mere interrogation. It was a duel of giants, a clash of 2 irreconcilable worldviews. For Bellarmine, the order established by God and guarded by the Church was the highest value. Any deviation from dogma was, to him, not just an intellectual error, but a deadly disease, a cancer on the body of Christendom that threatened to damn millions of souls. He sincerely believed that by forcing a heretic to recant, even through torture, he was saving his immortal soul from eternal damnation. He was willing to sacrifice one man's mortal body to protect the spiritual health of all society. For Bruno, the highest value was freedom of thought, the infinite search for truth. He saw in Bellarmine the embodiment of the very tyranny of the mind he had fought his entire life. Their dialogues, held in the grim atmosphere of the inquisitorial tribunal, were a battle of two absolute convictions. Bellarmine, with cold Jesuit logic, exposed the heretical essence of Bruno's philosophy, demanding clear answers. Do you believe in the Holy Trinity? Do you believe Christ is the Son of God? Bruno would try to evade, to argue, to offer philosophical interpretations, but time and again the cardinal forced him back to the harsh dichotomy. Yes or no? Faith or heresy? It would be Bellarmine who, 16 years later, would handle Galileo's case, but with far more caution. With Bruno, he was unyielding. He saw before him not a misguided scientist, but the diabolically proud prophet of a new anti-Christian religion. His goal was not to understand, but to destroy. After 7 years of interrogations, the inquisitorial tribunal reduced all of Bruno's errors to 8 primary heretical propositions. This was the essence of his guilt in the eyes of the Church. Unfortunately, the full text of these 8 theses has not survived. However, based on the interrogation protocols, historians have reconstructed their content. And this list eloquently answers our central question. The vast majority of these points had nothing to do with astronomy or science. They were purely theological and metaphysical assertions that struck at the very heart of Christian doctrine. Among them, it seems, were the denial of the dogma of the Trinity, the denial of Christ's divine nature and his redemptive sacrifice, the denial of the virgin birth, the teaching of reincarnation, and that the human soul is part of the universal soul of the world, the assertion of the eternity of the world, which contradicted the biblical account of creation, and finally, the doctrine of the existence of multiple worlds. This last point, which became his most famous, was just one of many. And most importantly, it was seen by the inquisitors not as a scientific hypothesis, but as a theological heresy that undermined the uniqueness of man and the divine plan of salvation. Furthermore, Bruno was accused of practicing magic and divination, which was considered communing with demonic forces. Thus, he was not sentenced for Copernicus. He was sentenced because he had, in essence, tried to create a new religion, a syncretic cult that blended Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and Egyptian magic. He stood trial not as a physicist, but as a metaphysician, not as an astronomer, but as an anti-theologian. By the beginning of the year 1600, after 7 years of imprisonment, Bruno's physical and mental strength was at its end. For a moment, he seemed ready to break. The protocols indicate that he expressed a willingness to admit his errors and recant the 8 propositions. It was a moment of great temptation. He was being offered his life in exchange for humiliation, for a public declaration that his entire life's work had been a diabolical mistake. For the Inquisition, this would have been the perfect victory, but they demanded not partial, but total, unconditional, and sincere repentance. They didn't just want his signature, they wanted his soul. And here, on the very edge of the abyss, something in Bruno changed. Perhaps he realized that such a recantation would be worse than death, that it would render his entire life meaningless. Perhaps the unbending spirit of Nola, the spirit of a warrior, reawakened in him. At one of his final hearings, he suddenly refused his intention to repent, stating that he had nothing to recant and nothing to be forgiven for. This sudden reversal was the final straw for his judges. They saw it as definitive proof of his diabolical obstinacy. On January 20th, 1600, the Pope himself, Clement VIII, made the final decision. Bruno was declared an unrepentant, obstinate, and inflexible heretic. His case was to be handed over to the secular authorities of Rome with the hypocritical request that he be punished without the shedding of blood, the standard formula for being burned alive. On February 8th, his death sentence was read to him. According to eyewitnesses, after listening, Bruno looked his judges directly in the eye and spoke the phrase that immortalized him. "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." In those words was his entire essence: defiance, pride, and contempt for those who, while holding power over his body, had no power over his spirit. The irony of fate, which so often accompanies great historical dramas, revealed itself in the finale of Bruno's life with a special, sinister force. He would enter the pantheon of 19th and 20th century martyrs as a prophet of the future, a scientist who was ahead of his time and died for scientific truth. But to the men who sent him to the stake, he was the exact opposite, a prophet of a cursed past. He was burned not for looking too far into the future, but for, in their view, digging too deep into the pagan past. In the eyes of Cardinal Bellarmine and his colleagues, Bruno was not Copernicus or Galileo. He was Simon Magus, a Gnostic, an Egyptian priest, attempting to resurrect the ancient magic and pagan cults that Christianity had fought for millennia to eradicate. His Hermetic religion, with its soul of the world, reincarnation, and deification of nature, was for them a relapse into the most terrifying paganism. His fascination with Egyptian wisdom was seen as a conscious appeal to demonic forces. His infinite universe was not so much a physical model as a metaphysical concept that destroyed man's unique place in creation. Thus, the paradox is that the martyr of science was executed for anti-science, as it was beginning to be understood at the dawn of the modern age. He was burned for magic, not for mathematics. His final act of defiance was seen not as a defense of free inquiry, but as the last gasp of satanic pride. The Inquisition, in destroying him, was convinced it was not halting progress, but protecting civilization from sliding back into the primal chaos of sorcery. This ironic finale, where the hero of the future was executed as a ghost of the past, is one of the most complex and instructive legacies of his tragedy. The execution on the Field of Flowers was a carefully staged state and church ritual, a spectacle designed to inspire awe and terror. Early on the morning of February 17th, 1600, Bruno was led from his cell. He was dressed in a heretic's robe, painted with images of devils and flames. Accompanied by members of the Confraternity of Mercy, who urged him to repent until the very last minute, he was marched through the streets of Rome to the execution site. The crowd reacted in different ways. Some prayed, some jeered, others watched in grim silence. When he was tied to the stake, one of the priests held a crucifix to his lips. Bruno, witnesses reported, turned his head away in disgust. It was his final gesture of defiance, a final rejection of the world that had rejected him. The executioner brought the torch to the firewood. The flames, at first reluctant, then greedy, began to devour the wood, climbing toward the condemned man's feet. We will never know what he thought in those last minutes. Perhaps of his mother, or the mountains around his native Nola. Or perhaps his mind, freed from bodily torment, was already soaring among those innumerable worlds in which he so fiercely believed. The smoke hid his figure, and the crowd heard only the crackling of the fire. His death was a symbolic act of purification. The fire was meant not only to destroy the heretic's body, but to erase the very memory of his ideas. to turn him to ash and scatter him on the wind. But, as so often happens, the flames of the pyre had the opposite effect. They did not destroy the idea. They forged it, transforming a controversial philosopher and magician into an immortal symbol of a martyr for freedom of thought. Death ended his earthly path, but it was death that began his long and paradoxical journey into eternity. After his execution, Giordano Bruno's name fell into oblivion for centuries. His books were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books, where they remained until the mid-20th century. His ideas were too radical, even for the boldest thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries. Only a few, like Spinoza or Leibniz, secretly read his works. For the Catholic world, he was a bogeyman. For the Protestant world, an inconvenient atheist. But in the 19th century, an age of turbulent change, his figure was resurrected. In Italy, the Risorgimento, the movement for unification and liberation from papal and Austrian rule, was underway. In this fight, the new secular authorities needed their own heroes and martyrs to counter the heroes and martyrs of the Church. Giordano Bruno was the perfect fit. He was transformed from a complex, contradictory thinker, magician, and religious reformer into a flat, but bright and simple figure. The martyr of science, killed by church obscurantism. His cosmological ideas were torn from the context of his magical and theological system and presented as brilliant scientific insights. His conflict with the Church was recast as a simple episode in the eternal war between science and religion. The culmination of this process was the raising of a monument to him on the very Campo dei Fiori in 1889, an act that drew furious protest from the Vatican. Bruno, standing in a defiant pose, staring toward the Vatican, became a powerful political symbol. This myth of Bruno the scientist proved so potent and attractive that it almost completely erased the complex and inconvenient historical truth. His legacy was rewritten to suit the needs of a new era, and this image continues to dominate the popular imagination to this day. And so, we return to the central question posed at the beginning. Why did the Inquisition really burn Giordano Bruno? The answer, stripped of myth and later interpretation, is complex, but it is clear. He was not burned for science. He was burned for religion. He was not burned for his belief in other worlds as an astronomical hypothesis, but because that hypothesis was an essential part of his grand project to completely destroy Christianity and replace it with a new, universal faith. His innumerable worlds were a theological battering ram, designed to smash a hole in the wall of Christian dogma and bring the entire structure crashing down. If there are many worlds, then the uniqueness of earth, man, and most importantly, Christ, loses all meaning. His crime was that he offered mankind a complete, thought-out, and incredibly seductive alternative spiritual system. In this system, there was no personal creator God, but an impersonal soul of the world. There was no original sin and redemption, but endless reincarnation. There were no church sacraments, but powerful magic that allowed man to become a god himself. Its chief prophet was not Jesus, but Hermes Trismegistus. Its holy scripture was not the New Testament, but the Corpus Hermeticum. For the Inquisition, this was not just dissent. This was the creation and preaching of a hostile religion, a direct challenge for spiritual supremacy. His cosmology was merely the facade for a new temple. That is why his sentence contains charges of denying the Trinity and Christ's divinity, not for defending Copernicus. His crime was not physics, but metaphysics, in its purest and most dangerous form. He was not just a heretic. He was an anti-prophet who brought his own anti-gospel. And for this, and this alone, he was committed to the flames. The tragedy of Giordano Bruno is more than just a historical episode. It is an eternal myth, a universal parable about the person who dared to challenge the gods of his time. But it is not the myth of Prometheus, stealing the fire of science for humanity. It is, perhaps, the story of Icarus, not one who flew too close to the sun of knowledge, but one who, blinded by pride, tried to build his own new sun to eclipse the light of the old faith. His story is not so much about the collision of science and religion, as it is about the collision of two total, all-encompassing, and uncompromising worldviews. On one side, the rigid, hierarchical, and finite cosmos of Catholic dogma, where everything has its place and purpose. On the other, Bruno's infinite, chaotic, and pulsating universe, where there is no center and no edge, and man is just one of countless forms of life. These two universes could not coexist. The conflict was existential. Bruno's story leaves us with eternal and troubling questions. Where is the line between genius and madness? What is the price of absolute loyalty to one's convictions? And why does history, in its search for simple symbols, so often prefer an inspiring myth to the complex and tragic truth? The silent silhouette of Giordano Bruno, frozen in the flames on the field of flowers, will forever remain a monument not only to the freedom of thought, but to its immense, destructive, and creative power, reminding us that the boldest ideas sometimes demand the highest price.